So let's get into it. Grounding urgency culture. So go ahead and share in the chat, what is your biggest work stressor right now? Okay, and mine, because I work for myself, is unstructured days. That is my biggest stressor because I'm my own boss. Being short-staffed. Okay, yeah. Short-staffed and too many hats. Okay, yeah. Uncertainty of grant funding. Absolutely. Funding unavailable and changing systems requirements. Yep. Managing competing priorities at the same time. Yep. Personnel issues. Absolutely. Lack of transparency, miscommunication, lack of communication, short staffed, and the team feeling the pinch of overwhelm. Yep. And this is great too because I can review these as I finalize everything for next week's solutions and tools. So I can address a lot of these issues in the solutions and tools. So this is great. Thanks everyone. Yeah, the pressure to do well in every role. Feeling responsible for staff's well-being, not fully staffed, financial issues. Absolutely. Yeah, it is a stressful time right now. So really holding space for all of these. Thanks everyone. And please feel free to keep adding those. Yeah. So I'm going to introduce myself. And then we'll get into urgency culture, workplace stress, urgency in the brain, and toxic personalities at work. And particularly, we're going to be looking at the issues today with a trauma-informed lens. So I have a master's in public health from Boston University. I graduated right when the pandemic started. So I graduated in December of 2019. And then just a couple months later, we were in full lockdown. So that was an interesting time to get an MPH. And I don't know how many of you can also relate, but that was also a really interesting time to need to be helping people. So, that was a time when I started hosting an online series called A Better Normal. I don't know if any of you ever attended that at Paces Connection, but I hosted different trauma experts on various topics. And I did that for several years, and it was really wonderful. And that just came out of the urgency of the pandemic and people needing to feel supported with lots of resources. So, my career has been in nonprofit management, education, environmental conservation, and human rights. And I was the associate director of curriculum at the Center for Child Wellbeing and Trauma at UMass Chan Medical School. And I talked to you a little bit about why we founded 10 Collective was just to implement these same trauma-informed care principles and policies for psychological safety in workplaces. These are my co-founders, Marianne, Danielle, and Bree, and these are all former colleagues of mine from Paces Connection and the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma. So these are all amazing experts who sometimes do some of the programming and also act as advisors for our training and curriculum development. So we help teams with low morale. We help integrate psychological safety. We can help implement structure, norms, and agreements. We train managers on people skills. We train we can do these big trainings with your whole staff on self-regulation skills. And we also offer one-on-one coaching. That's what I personally typically work with our clients on, is the one-on-one coaching, training assessments, and educational content. We can also put together programs for the people you serve as well. If you have any other questions, please let me know. So let's get into it. Urgency culture, is it an addiction? So we'll talk about that. Understanding urgency culture, what it's costing your team, and bringing in a trauma-informed lens. So urgency culture is the organizational norm that treats everything as equally critical and time sensitive. And oftentimes there are punishments that come along with urgency culture. So if you have any ideas on behaviors at work that come with urgency culture, the most abhorrent one that I personally encountered that I mentioned in a previous webinar was that I had a boss that I would say had a dark tetrad personality who used to call me at random times to make sure I was sitting at my desk. just to make sure. Just checking in. Does anyone have any other ones? Go ahead and drop them in the chat. So here are some factors. Um, Needing to respond instantly, rewarding busyness over effectiveness. In the chat, I can see fewer boundaries about when people are working and when they aren't available. Yes, relatable. And so from the chat, sending a text or calling staff if they don't immediately respond to an email. This person from my past also did that. The boss that would randomly come out and start criticizing my personal workplace setup. Are you kidding? Oh my gosh. These are already getting me fuming. Staff watching other staff to see if they are late. Oh gosh. Okay. Sometimes a freeze response and not knowing where to begin. Oh yeah, I see a freeze response quite often with the folks that we work with. And that is a really nice, easy, I mean, not easy, but it's a nice one to work with because it's often more internal than, maybe abusing others. So it's something that we can definitely help. We've definitely helped a lot of people with the freeze response and how to get started. But so thank you, everyone. Um, oh yeah, not being given all the information. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, yeah, so poor planning pushed as everyone else's emergency. I've worked in nonprofits and I've also worked in the private sector. And what I've noticed is that in nonprofits and public, the public sector, there aren't as many project managers. And I know that there can be a lot of jokes about project managers. Are they really useful? Da da da. But the problem is that when you don't have a project manager, someone really trained in really excellent project management skills, the planning gets skipped. And that's a part of urgency culture. So I'm often encouraging nonprofits and government agencies, like you need to have someone with high project management skills because this needs a timeline. This needs critical key steps. Someone needs to check in with everyone, make sure that everything's happening and everyone's okay. And I just see it skipped very often. And then also there needs to be an evaluation stage. So all these things that are part of a project management process. Last minute requests treated as normal, huge pet peeve of mine. Lack of priorities, so everything feels equally critical. Yeah, short timelines. Oh, celebrating. We did it where the crisis mode is heroism. Anyway, I mean, so many. Yeah, whoever's the most anxious sets the pace. The starting to get to be like a fear of seeming unresponsive, just if you're not always responding right away, and especially if you need to set aside some time to focus. So unclear decisions, unclear authority over who can make those decisions. Unpredictable clients can be a thing too. Um, and funder donor timelines and expectations can be really hard. Especially when it's like someone external to your org, it's harder to push back. So burnout happens when there's no reprieve. There may be moral injury, meaning that something isn't right, but you have to keep working in a way that doesn't align with your morals and values. Lack of attunement, meaning no one notices how you're doing or they don't care. You may be in the wrong role for your strengths, never feeling caught up. Exploitative upper management, pay may not be covering your expenses, emotional care fatigue, compassion fatigue, or having an unsupportive team. So this is kind of the end of the line when we think about urgency culture. If there's anything else related to burnout, please feel free to drop that in the chat. There's this great book. How many of you have read it? Raise of hands. Highly recommend this resource. It's a nice audiobook. It's by the Nagoski sisters, and they say that the good news is that stress is not the problem. The problem is that the strategies that deal with the stressors have almost no relationships to the strategies that deal with the psychological reactions our bodies have to those stressors. So to be well is not to live in a state of perpetual safety and calm, but to move fluidly from a state of adversity, risk, adventure, excitement back safely and calm and out again. So, we often talk about resilience as being that piece of bamboo who can, bend but then come back. And so, stress is not necessarily bad for you, but not having the right tools, not having the right supportive environment, not having the right boundaries and structure at work to protect employees. So, it's going to be impossible for you to not have stressors at work, but you have to set up the structure and environment that supports everyone so that you can be a little stressed and then reset and come back to normal. And then that cycle repeats and that people feel safe to ask for what they need and to share how they feel. So again, I'll get more into solutions next week. And of course, we all know that that we need to have stress. So positive stress is what motivates us to accomplish tasks and get going. And tolerable stress may be something small that happens or a reasonable deadline that we complete and then we're able to rest. But toxic stress, which is what we're going to talk about today, feels unrelenting and unreasonable. So it's a constant barrage and it doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem like it needs to happen. And it may be compounding stress that we experienced earlier in life or stress in other areas of our life to the point that it builds up to a point that we cannot bounce back. And I always like to include the research of Dr. Gabor Maté, trauma expert, and he says the research literature has identified 3 factors that universally lead to stress. And he is talking about the toxic kind of stress: uncertainty, the lack of information, and the loss of control. So we will find these factors in toxic work environments. So let's talk about stress. Okay, so if you have been to my talks before, what I always want to ground us in and come back to again and again is just understanding. And I know that you all know this because this is what you also teach the people you work with, but we're just going to start here and just remind ourselves what happens, right? When we perceive urgency, the amygdala, this is the brain hand model by Dan Siegel, comes online and he calls it flipping your lid. And the lid has the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking, logic, and executive functioning, and also helps us collaborate well with others. And so when the amygdala is activated, we're in a sense of constant urgency. We flip the lid and we lose our ability to work well with others, and we become very hypervigilant because suddenly we're in fight or flight mode. It's a tiger trying to attack us. We can't problem solve. We can't work well with others. We can't focus. We can't think about the best action to take in the moment if our lid is constantly flipped. We can't remember, what someone said at that meeting last week. So, when you understand how the brain works, it becomes impossible to want to maintain urgency culture because you quite literally don't have access to the parts of your brain that enable you to do good work when you're in a constant state of chronic stress. So, this is also tunnel vision. This is also how scammers, when they scam phone calls, I think of, what they try and do is get you into a state of urgency. Like, you need to wire me money right now, so that you can't think outside of suddenly the whole world beyond the call disappears and you're only thinking about that thing. So that's not good for workplaces because now we're not thinking about who can I collaborate with? What can we bring in? How can we solve this problem the best? So kind of think about that. And scammers are using urgency to just narrow our vision. And that's what we use. How can I get out of this fight or flight situation? It's so narrow. What we want to do is come back to a sense of safety where we feel spacious, like I can solve problems and bring in lots of ideas. But we can't do that if we're feeling chronically overstressed. So a loss of integrative thinking, scarcity, et cetera, et cetera. And then I just want to add that there's always nuance, okay? And so ADHD brains and neurodivergent brains often prefer states of urgency to get into a flow state. And that's just a little piece of nuance. We often will talk about neurodivergence in our presentations. Today, it's not a big focus. I think there are some recordings where we could probably go in a little more, but not in this one today. And it's something that we are happy to do workshops with, like with your how to support neurodivergent brains in the workplace. We're happy to do that with you if that's something your organization needs. Chronic urgency and stress over time is going to be a weakened immune function, increased inflammation, higher risk of chronic illness, depression, burnout, decreased focus, cognitive decline, weakened prefrontal cortex, decreased memory and learning, all these things. So over time, you're going to have an exhausted workforce who's doing subpar work. This is intuitive. So today, this is where we depart a little bit from the talks I did last month. We're going to talk especially using a trauma-informed lens and how to think about trauma in the workplace, okay? So chronic or complex stress from childhood compounds work-related stress. And so these are the 10 ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. And that was a study that was published in 1998 that really established the field very firmly. It was a peer-reviewed article that showed that when you have chronic stressors in childhood, this will show up as literally every health disorder, mental or physical, imaginable, from heart disease to depression, substance misuse to incarceration. So the more of these stressors you have, there's a dose response relationship. So then, the more complications that causes later in life. Okay. And so that's physical, emotional, or sexual abuse in childhood, physical or emotional neglect, mental illness in parents around you, incarcerated relatives, being around caregivers who have substance abuse issues, seeing violence, or experiencing divorce. And of course, subsequent studies have really added a lot onto these. And there are many, many more now that have been studied and published. But these were the 10 core, and it's a nice, simple framework we can kind of use to think about that. I think it's 64% of the adults in the survey sample. This was adults with Kaiser Permanente health insurance in San Diego who were sampled in the 90s. And they found that 64% of these adults had at least one adverse childhood experience. So when you think about your workplace and the people that you work with, the majority of the people that we work with are coming to work with at least one adverse childhood experience, but oftentimes two or more. And for people who work serving vulnerable populations, we often self-select these jobs for ourselves because we came from homes that had a lot of stress and now we want to fix the problem. So it's shown that healthcare workers have a disproportionate number of ACEs compared to people in other roles and jobs. So when you're working in these sectors, it's important to remember that there's going to be more of us with ACEs. That's why we're here. So we want to kind of think about the cycle of how organizations, and this is something that my colleague Bree Twombly calls being trauma organized, where you start to organize your organization or agency around trauma. So it's kind of like the opposite of being trauma informed, is that you don't understand what's going on and all of a sudden you're organized around the most dysfunction. So as children, we're just little sponges and we just absorb, even if we don't know it. And even if we're not aware, we're absorbing the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that we experience. Okay. So whatever it is that we get, that's what we have inside of us. And that's what we enter adulthood able to recreate. So we bring these attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors with us into adulthood, including our workplaces. And they combine with everyone else that we work with to form the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that form our work culture. So maybe you can take a moment to kind of think about, what attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors did I inherit in childhood? And I wonder how those showed up at work. And I wonder if I notice those in others. So when we leave those unquestioned and unexamined, a workplace can start to organize around trauma. And sometimes the least regulated, least self-aware, and most dysfunctional employee or employees will dominate the culture. How many of you have seen that at work? Yeah, we've all seen that. Okay. So pretty soon, employees are burned out, there's toxic levels of stress, the work quality decreases, collaboration becomes impossible, and resentment builds. How many of you have seen this? Okay, we'll just take a moment right now. He's specifically talking about, and you can see even on the cover, he's talking about substance use, but we're going to talk about the overlap between substance use and what that kind of addiction looks like, and addiction to urgency and the high we're kind of getting sometimes by having these cycles of chaos at work. And I think that this is a really nice one to illustrate how what we experience in childhood leads us to seek out certain self-soothing behaviors in adulthood. Sound is good?
So an addiction is a complex psychological, physiological process, but which manifests in any behavior that a person enjoys, finds relief in, and therefore craves in the short term, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice I have said nothing about substances. I said any behavior. So it could be related to cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, fentanyl, marijuana, nicotine, alcohol, whatever. Could also be sex, gambling, internet, relationships, shopping, eating, work, extreme sports, working out, pornography, any number of human activities. So I said any behavior. Now, the official definition of addiction, according to the American Society for Addiction Medicine, is that this is it's a primary brain disorder. It arises in the brain, largely due to genetic reasons. This is how they see it. And I say that's just not true. The other popular idea about addiction is that it's a choice that somebody makes, that people choose to be addicted, which is what the legal system is based on. Because if people are not choosing, what are we punishing them for? And although I think the medical definition is closer to the truth, I don't see it as it's a genetic disorder, and I don't see it as a primary brain disorder. So let me perhaps show you why, if that's okay. A human being has two fundamental needs, apart from the physical needs, in infancy, in childhood. One is for attachment. Now, attachment is the closeness and proximity with another human being for the sake of being looked after, or for the sake of looking after the other. Now, human beings, as mammals, and even birds, are creatures of attachment. We have to connect and attach because otherwise we don't survive. If there's nobody that's motivated to take care of us, to attach to us that way, and we're not motivated to attach to others, we just can't survive. One interesting thing is that the endorphins, which are the body's internal opiate chemicals, which heroin and all the other opiates resemble, they help to facilitate attachment. So if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors so they don't have endorphin opiate activity in their brain, they won't cry for help and separate from their mothers, which would mean that they would die in the wild. And which goes back to what happens early in childhood when there's stress and trauma, these endorphin systems don't develop. And then when people do heroin, it feels like a warm, soft hug to them. They feel love and connection for the first time. That's why it's so powerful. But so we have this need for attachment, which obviously the human infant, who is the most helpless, the most dependent, the least mature of any creature in the universe at birth, cannot survive without the attachment. And that attachment relationship, given that we have the longest period of development of any creature, well into adolescence and beyond, attachment is not a negotiable need. But we have another need, which is authenticity. Now, authenticity, out of the self, means being connected to ourselves, just knowing what we feel and being able to act on it. So that means our gut feelings. So let's look at how human beings evolved. For hundreds of thousands of years, and for 100,000 years or so of this species existing on Earth, how did we live? We didn't live in cities and houses and so on. We lived out there in the wild until very recently in human existence. Now, just how long do you survive in the wild if you're not connected to your gut feelings? Not very long. If you start using your intellect instead of your gut feelings, you just don't survive. So that's a powerful survival need as well. So attachment is a survival need, authenticity is a survival need. But what happens if your authenticity threatens your attachment relationships? For example, as a 2-year-old, you get angry because you didn't get that cookie before dinner. But your parents can't handle anger because they grew up in homes when there was rageaholism and they're terrified at the very expression of anger. So they give you the message that good little kids don't get angry. The message you receive is not that good little kids don't get angry, but that angry little kids don't get loved. Because your parents are now sullen, they won't look at you, they talk to you in a harsh way, you're not getting loved. Not experiencing love at that moment. Now, but you got to stay attached. Guess what you're going to suppress? The authenticity every time. And this is how we lose connection to ourselves and to our gut feelings. So that, strangely enough, that very dynamic, which is essential for human survival in a natural setting, now becomes a threat to our survival.
So you can watch the rest of that because I'll send out the slides. It's an amazing video. But I like that this example that he gives about the mom and the little girl and learning these messages that we carry with us that become our beliefs. And you can kind of even see like we have the child here and then we have like the business guy here, right? And so we're bringing our inner child with us into work. And we're bringing these various complicated dynamics that we learned in childhood with us into work. And it's really important that we have this trauma-informed lens when we're at work because we want to know, why am I having this reaction? Why do I have this limiting belief? Why do I have this behavior? And we also want to understand, why do the people around us, why are they all behaving like this? And what we especially want to pay attention to is whether people seem to be reasonable and accountable, and whether we can trust people and whether people can become self-aware and make changes or not. And we'll get a little bit more into that. We start to get addicted to urgency and chaos at work the same way that we would get addicted to substances or other things that we could use to feel a sense of relief. So one thing is that if we experienced a lot of stress in childhood, elevated cortisol levels start to feel normal to us, and we have a recalibrated baseline. So that urgency is what feels familiar and calm feels unsafe. Also, action-demanding tasks and environments trigger dopamine, and dopamine feels good. So we get a reward every time that we feel urgency, actually. And so this is another thing that will keep us stuck in these loops, is that sometimes it feels really good. So for those with one or more ACEs, and of course I'm in that camp, urgency dopamine cycles will be a coping strategy that can be pretty identical to other addictions, okay? Because we get a hit of dopamine every time that we are rewarded. So when we get in the urgency and we feel that intensity and our focus narrows, and maybe we even accomplish something really great, and then we get even more of these feel-good chemicals because we're rewarded. Hey, good job on getting that report done, on getting that done by Friday. You did great. And now we have more feel-good chemicals. And now when we come down from that feeling, we may go, I want to have that again. And the reason for that is because when we're kind of in the rest and digest space with the default mode network going, this is where we have active rest, self-reflection, and unstructured thought. But for those of us with ACEs, this is also the place with intrusive memories, grief, dread, things that we have been trying to suppress and keep out of our conscious awareness, okay? Things that may have happened in childhood that felt overwhelming and that made us feel helpless. When we are in a rest state, those things come up to the surface and they say, hey, what about me? And so by staying in a constant loop of urgency and that narrowed focus, that fight or flight focus, we can stay out of these memories and thoughts that we are trying to keep away. And so, just like any other addiction, we start to feel addicted to a rush of intensity at work. And so I think we can all reflect on whether this rings true for us personally or whether we can see this in people around us. And just by having that gentle awareness, we can increase our compassion, increase our boundaries appropriately, understand the world around us, because understanding reduces stress. So just by saying, you know what, I think this person probably went through a lot as a kid and they seem to be addicted to urgency, but now that I know that about them and I can see that, I can have better boundaries. And also, just by merely understanding what's going on, I'm feeling less stressed. Okay. So I want to give you permission to see what you're seeing at work. Okay. And a lot of times what I'll hear is, well, you don't want to diagnose people. That is not what this is about. This is about owning what you see around you and being able to understand so that you can reduce your own stress. Okay. So you don't need to go around diagnosing anyone, but you want to be able to identify in yourself and others, I think this could be a trauma response, or I think this could be an addiction cycle. We can also get addicted to a sense of control over others, so getting an ego hit. There's lots of different things that way stroke a person's ego and give us a good dopamine hit. Or arousing an emotional reaction from others. So, that could be a small manipulation into, I've definitely seen plenty of sadism in the workplace where it does seem like the people in power really take delight in making others suffer. I'm sure many of us have seen that at work. And so we may forget, or we may never have practiced, or we may work with others who have never practiced slowing down, pausing, and asking ourselves, how am I feeling? What does my body feel like? What is my intuition telling me? Just like the video. A lot of people with childhood trauma come out of childhood not being able to feel what we feel in the body or have access to our intuitive knowing because that violated our attachment needs. To be able to say, is this working well? Or is this the right position for me? Should I be working here? Does this align with my needs? And even like, what does the organization need, or the people I manage, what do they need? It's really hard to know what those things are if we're always going in an urgency stress cycle. So, just like we were talking about being a sponge as a child and just inheriting a lot of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, some of those might be. And so, as I go through these, please think of what else you may have inherited and go ahead and share that in the chat. But it could be rest has to be earned. Or even like I feel like in the US, like no one deserves rest. I think I wasn't until I was like in my mid 30s that I got a job with 4 weeks of paid vacation. And I mean, that's just wild. In other countries in the world, it's not like that. If I don't hold it together, everything falls apart. Emergencies are normal. Every problem is an emergency. My value is conditional on my performance. Conflict means the relationship is over. That is one that I see a lot. A lot. And especially also, I don't want to upset anyone because it'll ruin everything. Asking for help is dangerous, right? I don't want to rock the boat, or I don't want people to know that I don't know what I'm doing. Some behaviors might be hypervigilance. I have seen this a lot where certain folks with trauma who had to watch their parents' every move in childhood, they'll be the person in the meeting that's like, I think this person's a little bit upset, or I think I said the wrong thing, or I think that when that person looked at that person, it did this. And that is something that I've had to coach employees on how to move through that and just let people have the reactions that they're going to have, and it's okay, and you don't have to manage any of them, and you're not in trouble. Over delivering, and especially not having any boundaries. Yes, I'll work late. I'm so afraid that I'm going to get in trouble or lose my job that I'll do anything. Difficulty with endings and transitions is probably one we don't talk about enough. What else? What do we bring with us into the workplace from childhood. Panic mode first, yeah. Yeah, because we can get into a mode where we go into fight or flight really quickly. Yeah. Okay, keep typing those while I move forward just because we have a few more slides to get through. Oh, how people do their work is a direct reflection on me. Yeah, and they have to be perfect too. Yeah, that's a tough one. Oh, I have more resources and privilege than my clients, so I have no right to draw boundaries and protect my well-being. Yeah, actually, I have seen that one with some of our clients who are serving disadvantaged populations. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that one. Um, so have you all seen this image? This is a Burning Man sculpture from probably over 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Who has seen this? This is something that I'm sharing actually quite often in my conflict management coaching and training for organizations, because even though I think that what they're trying to get at here is maybe it's a couple having a fight, and what you have to remember is that it's your inner child coming out and wanting to be seen. This is the same exact dynamic that is coming out at workplaces. And in my one-on-one coaching work with managers and anyone who supervises people or has to work with diverse groups of people, the thing is that our inner child, and our wounding will come up, and theirs is also going to come up. And we all actually really want our core needs to be met, and we want to work well together, and we want to feel seen, and we want to feel safe. And we have to remember that these wounds are coming up, and that when we may be having these disagreements at the workplace, and sometimes they can get quite volatile. In my several years of doing this consulting work and getting in there, and really like what's going on with this conflict, is that people are bringing their wounds to work. And we have to tend to those. And so we want to tend to our own inner child and tend to those wounds and soothe and find healthy ways to soothe, but without taking it out on anyone. And the other person needs to do the same. And then that lid can get unflipped and go back down. And then all of a sudden we can have positive regard and work collaboratively with others. And, bring in our best resources. So this is an image to keep in mind. Okay, so let's see what we can get to, and whatever we don't get to, I'll just throw it into part 2 next week, okay? So the urgency manufacturers, toxic personalities, workplace psychological violence, and leaders who make chaos. So I would say it's been a mixed bag in my career. I've had really, really wonderful managers and bosses that made me want to commit to this work because I knew the power and importance of having a supportive boss and a psychologically safe boss at work, and how wonderful it could make my life. As you all mentioned at the beginning, everything in the world is so uncertain right now, but we're at work 40 hours a week. It has the potential to be the safest place for us. It has the potential to support us and make us feel better, and to remind us that the work we're doing matters in the world, and that this can be the one thing that feels the best to us. It has that potential. I have experienced it. Has anyone else had a job like that? Or maybe you feel that way now? Yeah, it feels so good. And then when you have the opposite, and it's like ruining your mental health, stressing you out, you don't understand why you're there, and no one appreciates you, it just compounds everything that already feels so terrible in the world. So we really want to be a part of that change. So it's good to do as much research as you can on dark tetrad. And so when I send out resources, I'm going to provide a list of folks you can read their articles and follow on LinkedIn. But it's nice to understand these dark tetrads, because you'll want to be able to recognize it quickly and, strategize. How many of you have ever encountered a dark personality at work? So this is someone with, Machiavellianism, so always trying to get ahead and manipulate, narcissism, psychopathy, or sadism. And I have seen all these things plenty of times at work. Luckily, not always, but they exist. And, if you just have one of these people in your workplace, they can really do a lot of damage. So it's really, really important. One of the best things you can do for your organization is to realize quickly when you have a dark tetrad personality, and to get them out of your org. So oftentimes we will have cultural reinforcement of psychopathy. And it's interesting because in our, in the public sphere where we all work, it will most often show up as savior complex. And it will more often be covert narcissism than overt narcissism. So it shows up a little differently in the private sector than it does in the public sector. I'm sure you all can think about how that's shown up and how you've seen that. But the most toxic leader I ever worked for would constantly talk about all the poor little kids we needed to save, which was really weird phrasing and a weird way of thinking. So, we want to try and move away from, saviorism and white saviorism, and more towards collective solutions. So that's a whole topic that we could do a whole nother presentation on. Oh yeah, so this is from American Psycho, the film. Yeah, okay, but I did put one on here. I've noticed in the public sector nonprofit is that the person who can bring in the most funding is often rewarded the most, even if they're not a psychologically safe leader. So if there's anything else missing, go ahead and put it in the chat. Gray rock method is where you've decided that you don't emotionally react. You don't meet someone there. You set an emotional boundary. So, okay, you're needing to control me, but I'm going to just be a gray rock. I'm going to not buy into that. I'm just not going to care that you need that from me. I'll still do what's needed for me in my job, but I'm not going to care that much. And so that's one method on how to get through working with difficult personalities. And so, if you have a boss who's unreasonable with low self-awareness and a high need for control or making chaos, you want to make an exit strategy. And the gray rock method can be a stopgap until you are able to safely get out with, a job that covers your expenses. I would say the biggest red flag is inability to take accountability, right? So you really want to work with people who say, yeah, I did actually talk over you at that meeting and I'm sorry. And then the next time they actually change their behavior. So you want people who, you want to work for people and with people, and you want to be someone who can say, yeah, actually I did do that. Sorry about that. I'll bet that didn't feel good. And I'm going to change my behavior and it's going to get better over time. When you notice that the people you work with never seem to change and grow, even when they apologize, that can be a huge red flag. Okay. We want to try and work with people who seem reasonable and are self-aware and can change their behavior and care about how other people are doing. And we want to work with people who we notice that they care how their actions make other people feel. So we want to highlight, and I just have like 3 more slides on this, so we're almost done. We want to highlight at 10 Collective that most often, and I've seen this where someone will say, and they're just a toxic boss and they don't care and da da da. But I'll meet with everyone and I'm realizing, okay, no one here is a psychopath. So what's going on actually? And so sometimes a person just needs new skills and tools and they just need to practice them. And that's, what we love helping people with. So, with emotion regulation, also, we may work with someone who someone is perceiving as having toxic traits, and we'll just say like, how are your childhood wounds coming up? How are you seeking that ego hit? How are you creating chaos? How can you implement structure? And we just teach these skills. And so if someone is able to change, have self-awareness and accountability and actually change their behavior, they're not toxic. They just need new skills. Okay. So these are all things that people can learn: self-soothing, distress tolerance, tuning into the body, labeling feelings. This is all stuff that we love to teach. It's kind of our bread and butter. Communication skills. I love teaching these. We have a few frameworks that we teach. Asking for what you need. I mean, honestly, when I do the trainings, even identifying what you need as an employee is really hard for people. Really, really hard. When I put up a list of needs, most often people's reaction is, I never thought about needing that before. So feedback can be really tough to receive and give, whether it's positive or negative. Repair after rupture is huge. So, and all, again, like sort of tolerance and self-regulation, conflict resolution skills. Just as we talked about earlier, a lot of us inherited in childhood, like if there's conflict, then I'm not safe anymore. So I got to avoid that. So, you just helping people understand that rupture and repair is normal and healthy. And especially that conflict gives us the opportunity to share with what we need with someone so that they can care about us is really wonderful. And that's how we build relationships. Okay. And so when we bring up, hey, actually, it seemed like maybe you took my idea without giving me credit, we're giving that person the opportunity to care about us and to say, oh my gosh, you're so right. Let me change that and put your name on there. I'm so sorry. And again, we don't want to work with people who don't care about us. So that's why we want to bring up conflict to just make sure and check. Okay. So these are all things that 10 Collective can help with. We do trainings and coaching for excellent communication, conflict resolution, and we also do mediation services as well for folks to work together and work on resolving conflicts that are really contentious. So we offer that as well. I personally do that. So that is it for today. I really appreciate seeing so many faces. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Trip.